This video is sponsored by 40K Combat Cards. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to another installment of the best armies in Warhammer 40K. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past week of competitive singles events. And this episode is for the weekend of November 16th and 17th, 2024. This weekend saw several mid-sized GTs. A lot of the results from this weekend were from events like the ITT, the International Team Tournament. So we have a lot of team results, which I won't be discussing on this video, but I will be going over in a live stream on the channel. So don't forget to click subscribe if you want to get notified when that goes live. However, we did see a major level event in the Alliance Open, which we'll certainly be talking about, and a bunch of other 30 to 50 player events. So with that being said, and without further ado, let's dive into a metagame breakdown. This weekend was actually dominated by a faction that you might not expect, especially given recent discourse around the competitive scene and factions like Astra, Militarum, and Genestealer Cults. We actually saw these guys do pretty well a couple weeks ago, but they're returning with another really strong weekend, this being Chaos Knights, who went undefeated not only at the Alliance Open, but also at the AGT, Team Austria Kickoff, El Legado de Dardo, and GuardCon. Genestealer Cults themselves also going undefeated at the Alliance Open. We're going to talk about both of those lists for sure, but they also won the Manatorsk Open GT and the Standoff 2024. Now, that event was streamed by none other than yours truly. So if you head on over to the live section of my channel, you can actually watch the VODs for that live stream and exactly how Genestealer Cult took it down. There's also a Warhound Titan that appears on that live stream. It was sick. It was a pretty good weekend. We played trivia on stream. What a time. Death Guard also had a surprisingly strong weekend at the Second Siege of Windsor, the Gravel Pit 3, as well as West Coast Wargames. However, that was a result with a tie, XO-1, so not all wins on the record, but still technically undefeated. World Eaters also doing fairly well at the TLM X Leighton Guti Majestic Beauties. This is an interesting event because it did allow legends to be used, so a little bit of a non-standard metagame there, as well as the Hobart GT. Thousand Suns took down BolterCon 2024 and Hammer Time Leo. Astra Militarum did make a showing this week, taking down the Tournoi Black Shield tournament. It seemed like events were split pretty evenly between allowing or disallowing the new World Championships of Warhammer FAQ that I discussed in my video last week, that slightly nerfs Tempestus Aquilons, the new powerhouse unit from the faction. So not every event allowed the Astra Militarum to be playing at their full power, but given the fact that that is an errata that we are likely to see coming next month, I don't think that's too surprising. We also saw Chaos Space Marines take down the Coco's November GT. Dark Angels actually repping the Loyalist Space Marines at the Dice Hammer Highlander charity event. This was an interesting event, however, the Highlander style, making essentially every unit in the game an epic hero. We'll talk about that format later on when we discuss the list, as well as a couple XO-1s at the Lakes of Blood Rotorua and West Coast Wargames, actually tying with those Death Guard for that top space. Those go to Imperial Knights and Tyranids, who we are going to be talking about as well. Now, in terms of coverage for this week, there was a lot of streaming available. I mentioned myself at the Standoff GT. Please go check out that coverage. We had some absolutely incredible games on stream, as well as some really great showcases of the insane things you can do with fight phase manipulation, especially in the Genestealer Cult faction. Wargames Live streamed the aforementioned Legends Allowed Guti Majestic Beauties event. Tabletop Live was at the Beer and Pretzels Open. This was a team event, so we weren't discussing the results of that today, but if you want some team coverage, you can go check that out. And Glasshammer Gaming was live at the Gravel Pit 3. In addition, the Second Siege of Windsor was streamed over on Twitch at British Army Esports. If there are any additional live streamers that I missed in this breakdown, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section as well, and make sure that we can get as many eyes on their content as possible. And with that, we're going to move on to discussing the lists just after a brief word from our sponsors. Did you know 40K used to be a card game? And actually, it still is. It's called Warhammer 40K Combat Cards. This is based on the 1980 Citadel combat cards that was a reuse of ancient Citadel miniatures from the dawn of time in a trading card game setting. And for the last 5 years, Warhammer 40k Combat Cards has sought to bring that old game back to modern audiences on iOS, Android, and on Steam. The current incarnation of Warhammer 40k Combat Cards uses modern game mechanics as well as updated visuals using modern Games Workshop miniatures painted by the Heavy Metal team. So, not only is it a good way to pass the time, but you can also use it to brush up on your miniature knowledge. So download the game from the links in the video description and enjoy live events, an ever-evolving card range, as well as new features currently being released, such as a Horde mode, Apocalypse mode, and Wild Card unlocks. Big thanks to Warhammer 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you at the card table. We're going to start off strong with a discussion of the weekend's biggest event, the Alliance Open Grand Tournament, held in the Netherlands. This event ran 6 rounds, but at 137 players, it had too many players to get to a single undefeated in just those 6 rounds, so we ended up with 2 undefeated at the end, and we're going to discuss both of those. First off, let's rip the band-aid off by talking about Chaos Knights. Dick Vanderharst went undefeated with the faction. Now, while Chaos Knights' continued success is very impressive, their lists do tend to be kind of more of the same, as the title of this list implies. This is running a War Dog Stalker with no enhancements, as well as 5 War Dog Brigands, the range variant of the War Dog chassis, and 6 War Dog Carnivores to add some melee punch. We then also had some utility being brought by a Chaos Demons allied section, including 2 Nurgling units as well as a unit of Plague Bearers. The Plague Bearers are a good inclusion here because they allow you to lock in objectives under your control if they control them at the start of your command phase. Normally, that place is taken by the Stalker using its Aura of Terror, but oftentimes that means that the Stalker's out of position and in a weird spot, and the Plague Bearers can play a little bit more aggressively without you having to worry about losing an entire War Dog for the opportunity to lock those objectives. The Nurglings in there as well are also good just for scoring maneuver-style secondaries and also blocking off enemy pre-game moves with their Infiltrator's ability. Now moving on to the number 1 place at the event, Dino Co. went undefeated with Genestealer Cults, going 6-0. Dino is rocking what is very quickly becoming the most popular variety of Genestealer Cults, the Biosanctic Brood Surge, and we actually watched a list very similar to this play at the Standoff GTs. So if you want to see how games with this list are executed, you can go ahead and check out my Day 2 coverage of that. We did watch Stephen Pampreen play that list over his semifinal and finals games. This one in particular is rocking an Abominant with Predatory Instincts to allow his unit to infiltrate, alongside 2 additional Abominants with no enhancements, a Biophagus, and a Patriarch with Biomorph Adaptation to improve its AP and damage characteristics. That was followed up by a brick of Acolyte Hybrids, 3 units of 5 with Hand Flamers, and 1 unit with Auto Pistols. The Auto Pistol unit is cheaper and adds a nice additional melee threat, whereas the Hand Flamer units are excellent at clearing chaff and opening up the table to allow the larger, more dangerous Aberrant squads to deep strike onto the table. We had a single Goliath truck to carry those guys into the fight, 3 units of 5 Aberrant to attach those Abominants into, as well as a bunch of Achilles Ridge Runners to add some backline fire support. That included 2 units of 2 with heavy mining lasers and 1 with a Survey Auger to strip cover from enemies that it hit. That one was rocking a heavy mortar, so it is able to fire indirectly, but without the spotter attached, it is only doing so at a 4+ ballistic skill. And with -1 to hit, shooting it targets outside of its line of sight, it might be hitting on 5s, so that does get a little bit dicey, but if you are able to score a hit, you are, in many cases, basically adding 2 to your AP values, especially if you're firing at it with the other Achilles. If the other Achilles Ridge Runners are also committing into the fight and shooting at units that you're then going to charge, they can spread additional crossfire effects around to add to your armor penetration for your melee units on top of that, so they can also buff up things like your Aberrants to a very impressive AP value. We then also had a bunch of Pure Strain Genestealers, 2 units of 5 and 1 unit of 10. Those guys are all going to infiltrate up alongside the Patriarch and the Predatory Instinct. They're going to force themselves into the opponent's deployment zone, try to pin them in place and clear out their screens to allow the additional Aberrants and Acolyte Hybrid units to deep strike later on. Following that up as well is a hybrid metamorph squad. This guy is likely attaching in with the Biophagus to get all of the detachment abilities. They can jump into the Goliath truck and act as just a second wave counterpunch. They don't necessarily need to deep strike onto the table if they're being delivered by a transport, and they're rocking a bunch of hand flamers to clear screens as well. This is a relatively standard variety of the Biosanctic Brood Surge. It's becoming extremely popular among Genestealer Cult players, outstripping other detachments like Outlander Claw that previously saw a lot of play. So I think a list archetype very similar to this is something that we should get used to seeing, at least for the next couple of weeks. Now we're going to stick with the Chaos theme for a couple of entries here and talk about Death Guard, who in fact tied with Genestealer Cult for the most undefeated this week. That included the second siege of Windsor GT, a 38-player GT held appropriately in Windsor in the United Kingdom. And this event was taken down by Alex Nikolic, who was running a epic hero-centric variety of a plague company. This included a living plague-equipped sorcerer in Terminator armor, Mortarion, as well as Typhus. For utility, the list included 2 units of Death Guard spawn, 3 units of Death Guard cultists, adding just a ton of objective securing power onto the battlefield. We also then had a bunch of backline shooting, including 3 Predator Destructors. Following that up was 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators, likely to attach in the 2 Terminator characters, Typhus and the Terminator Sorcerer. We had a Fetid Bloat Drone equipped with 2 Plague Spitters, 1 unit of Poxwalkers, which is an alternate attachment point for Typhus, theoretically, although, to be honest, I think they're just acting as a 4th unit of Death Guard cultists, essentially, given the fact that both the Death Shroud Terminators and Typhus benefit enormously when the unit is attached. Interestingly, we also had a pretty impressive demon contingent, including 1 unit of Nurglings, unlocking a non-battle line slot to include Rotigus. Now, Rotigus has been a fairly common inclusion in a lot of Death Guard armies more recently. In addition to Mortarion, he adds another huge, impressive body to the table with strong defensive stats that is difficult to get through. He himself slaps absolutely immensely in combat, able to buff up his own offensive output while still benefiting from the debuffs that Death Guard normally apply to their targets. You can be -1 save and -1, you can potentially be -1 save or -1 to hit, as well as -1 toughness, and Rotigus can buff his own damage up by 1 when hitting you with his big gnarl rod. He also reduces the movement characteristic and OC of enemies around him, making him absolutely excellent at camping those infected objectives once the mass of Death Guard cultists have secured them for the Death Guard player. Oftentimes, when the Death Shroud Terminators and Mortarion are bullying up the center of the table and the Predator Destructors are firing from behind, Rotigus can act as sort of a flanker to actually absolutely dominate a weaker side of the table and prevent enemies from getting around behind the Death Guard formation, one of their big weaknesses given how slow the faction tends to be. Now with that, let's move on to another Cult Chaos Space Marine faction. This time, we're going to go all the way across the big pond to Florida in the US and talk about the TLMX Layton November GT. Now the reason we're talking about this over any of the other World Eaters results this weekend was that Daniel Klavstad went undefeated at the event and won the GT with an absolutely wild variety of World Eaters build. This included Angron, Lord Invocatus, 2 units of Jackals, and 3 units of Chaos Spawn for utility, as well as, then, impressively, 30 Terminators. That's it. That's the whole list. Now, we've actually seen a list like this played on this channel just a couple weeks ago at the Onslaught Tampa Open, where it was played in a team format to absolutely bully a wide variety of matchups. The fact that World Eaters Terminators are equipped with Reaper autocannons and Combi Bolters, in addition to their impressive melee output, means that they can bring both the normal effectiveness of World Eaters in melee, but then also be able to clear enemy screens and hordes with their shooting attacks. This makes them a well-rounded threat, and despite the fact that Terminators are typically slow and difficult to get into melee, the massive movement improvements that Blessings of Khorne can apply on the units actually circumvents this pretty well. On top of that, we also have Lord Invocatus to allow them to scout too, so they're able to get up the table quickly, potentially advance and charge into your opponent's face, or simply benefit from +2 movement, move up aggressively, shoot all your opponent's screens away, and then charge into their backline. While Terminators do have a lot of weaknesses, and there is the potential that they can all go down to really heavy anti-infantry shooting, the fact that they are so fast and so good at clearing screens means that oftentimes they can circumvent this. This style of list is absolutely wild and definitely very different than the normal 8-bound centric variety of World Eaters that we typically see, but it's super cool to see armies like this seeing success. Now with that, we're going to move up north a little bit to BolterCon 2024, a 48-player grand tournament held in Ohio. This one was taken down by Jeff Perry, who rocked Thousand Suns to the weekend. Jeff's list included Ahriman on a Disc of Tzeentch, an Exalted Sorcerer with the Umbralific Crystal to allow him to teleport, an Exalted Disc Sorcerer, the Lord of Forbidden Lore, to give him multiple uses of rituals, an Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex, as well as Magnus the Red. We then had only 2 units of Rubric Marines, 1 of 5, likely to attach with the Arcane Vortex Infernal Master to give him the benefit of their datasheet ability, as well as a large unit of 10, who is probably hanging out with that Exalted Sorcerer, who's probably hanging out with the Exalted Sorcerer, allowing the army to apply an enormous amount of damage with a relatively resilient profile with that 4+ invulnerable save from Arcane Shield, almost anywhere on the table, being able to teleport the unit around. We then had 2 units of Zangors to generate some additional Cabal points, as well as 3 Beetleth Vortex Beasts and a unit of Chaos Cultists to round out the remainder of the list. Pretty standard Thousand Suns stuff. It is interesting to see a pivot into the larger and now newly discounted Rubric Marine squads, as well as back into the triple Beetleth Vortex Beast. And the Exalted Sorcerer is an interesting inclusion in this list as well. His ability to not only protect his models in his unit, but also regenerate them over the course of the game makes him a pretty interesting inclusion with a 10-man brick like this that can potentially bring Rubric Marines onto the table a little bit more efficiently now than the smaller 5-man bricks. But other than that, a lot of what we see in this list is fairly standard Thousand Suns fare. Now moving on even farther north and back into the warm embrace of the Imperium, let's talk about the Tournoi Black Shield Tournament, a 43-player GT being held in Montreal, Quebec. This event was taken down by John Winter Russell, playing Astra Militarum. John's list included Gaunt's Ghosts, Lord Solar Leontis, as well as 3 Militarum Tempestus command squads. That adds an immense amount of deep striking potential to the list, but unfortunately, because Lord Solar is in the list, he must be the Warlord, so we don't get the additional benefit of the Tempestus command squads being able to bring battle line Militarum Tempestus units. We do have Grand Strategist on one of the Tempestor Primes in one of those units, allowing him to issue 2 orders when he arrives on the battlefield, thanks to the most recent update to the Astra Militarum Index. That potentially, alongside the Command Rod on the Tempestor Prime, allows him to issue 2 orders to his own unit, giving them +1 to hit and additional attacks with their rapid fire weapons potentially. It's interesting to see that enhancement taken away from the Tank Commander, who's also in the list, where it usually sits to issue additional orders to things like Leman Russ or Rogaldorns. We also have a platoon command squad in there, as well as a unit of Death Corps of Krieg that can attach together alongside Lord Solar Leontis to give them use of his Master Box. In order to add a little bit of melee counterpunch to the army, we had a unit of Attilan Rough Riders, alongside a unit of Kazarkin, a regimental attaché unit, a Rogaldorn battle tank, and some support from 2 Scout Sentinels, as well as 2 units of Tempestus Aquilons, and 3 units of 5 Tempestus Scions. Now, that's not all in the list, because the list also had a pretty impressive dedicated transport selection, including a Chimera and 2 Taurox Primes. Now, I actually made a video about how powerful Tempestus Scions attached into Taurox Primes actually are, especially after the sequential updates to the Astra Militarum Index to improve the power level of out-of-sequence orders. This allows you to potentially embark a unit of Tempestus Scions alongside the Tempestor Prime in his command squad into the Taurox Prime, disembark them, issue orders to them after the Taurox Prime, issue orders to them at the end of the movement phase, and if you're bringing any other characters out of reserve or out of a transport in that same turn, stack extra orders on them too. Although I don't believe that's what this list is doing in this case. The Taurox Prime has fire support on its datasheet, so it's able to give you wound rerolls when targeting the thing that it shot at, and the Tempestus Scions themselves can also just get hit rerolls. If you are benefiting from both +1 to hit and additional attacks, plus the full rerolls targeting enemies on objectives, you have the potential to trigger additional sustained hits from the Tempestor Prime's leadership ability, which, combined with the wound rerolls from the Taurox Prime itself, and all of the other stacking buffs that Militarum can potentially dump onto that unit, that makes special weapons in the Tempestus Scion squads like plasma guns absolutely lethal to a wide variety of targets. Even heavily armored targets that Tempestus Scions typically struggle against will still be suffering damage from these things thanks to those Taurox Primes. The Chimera is also an interesting inclusion as well. I believe that that is going to be a home to the Kazarkin squad. There's a little bit of anti-synergy there. The Kazarkin do issue orders to themselves in the command phase. If you disembark them from a transport, unfortunately, they don't issue that order to themselves, so they only do that if they start on the table, but it does give you the opportunity to rocket that unit very far up because they can grant their scout to a dedicated transport that they're embarked into. You can then move the transport, push them super far forward, and dump the Kazarkin out almost anywhere on the table on turn 1. Now, in addition, the regimental attachés I think are an important inclusion right now as well. They can kind of break the mirror match potentially, and also help to solve a lot of other powerful matchups with close-range deep strikes. Things like Genestealer Cults, Host of Ascension, Chaos Demons, and Necrons are all very relevant, all of which have 3-inch deep strikes, and the regimental attachés can shut them down with Divination from the unit's attached Astra path. Because Lord Solar Leontis's unit with his attached platoon command squad is oftentimes camping the home objective, these guys can be used to protect that objective and your backline from being jumped into by enemy close deep strikers or other utility units. For 40 points, they don't do much else besides that, but it is a nice inclusion if you need that kind of utility. You can get Imperial Agent Navigators as well, theoretically, but they are more expensive and single entity units. So it's more difficult to protect them, and so you'd have to make cuts elsewhere, and it's more difficult to protect them. The regimental attachés come with some baggage of their own, with the requirement, for example, that they have to attach into a command squad, otherwise they just kill themselves before the game begins. However, if it's a tool that you need, they're definitely worth it. Now with that, we're going to move back to the Forces of Chaos and discuss Coco's November GT. This one was taken down by Colin Cochran, running Chaos Space Marines. Colin was taking a Renegade Raiders detachment led by none other than Abaddon the Despoiler, alongside a Chaos Lord, Cypher, and Huron Blackheart. Huron is an interesting inclusion in this. List, giving you access to potentially a reactive move, even in a detachment that doesn't normally have it. And with the huge buffs that Renegade Raiders typically provide for embarking and disembarking transports, one thing that you can do with Huron is play him very aggressively with the intention of using his reactive move to re-embark him into transports and get those disembarkation benefits a second time. The list also included a Cultist Mob, 1 unit of Legionnaires, a Chaos Rhino, as well as 2 units of Chaos Bikers for utility, 2 Predator Destructors, as well as 2 Chaos Vindicators to add some backline shooting, a unit of 5 Chosen, and 2 units of 2 Obliterators. The Obliterators are actually becoming more and more common as we continue to move on and develop the Chaos Space Marine metagame, which has been a really interesting development. But definitely being able to fire indirectly at enemies on objectives and get all of the benefits from the detachment ability, basically regardless of line of sight, is a big deal for these guys. Now this list is likely just attaching Huron Blackheart and the Chaos Lord to the Legionnaires and the Chosen. Abaddon the Despoiler doesn't really need to attach into anything. He's actually resilient enough and maneuverable enough, being in a single infantry model, that he can operate independently and simply hide and cover before the end of the game. Obviously, he does get super powerful if he's able to jump into a Chosen unit and get advance and charge, but that's not strictly necessary for him. He's likely going to be used to power the gun line of the Predator Destructors and Chaos Vindicators in order to give them their hit rerolls that can then trigger the sustain or lethal hits that they've pacted for using that they've asked for using their Dark Pacts. Now with that, before moving on to factions with just X0-1 records, let's talk about the Loyalist Mirror of Chaos Space Marines and discuss the Dice Hammer Highlander Charity GT being held in Irvine, California. This was a triple threat of a charity event, donating not only to the Table War charity account, but also the Pacific Marine Mammal Center and Second Harvest Food Bank. Not only is this a laudable goal, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this event also used a Highlander format. This is a classic format that's been used in a wide variety of miniature games and other tabletop games that requires that you only have 1 inclusion of each unit or entity type in your army. The way that this worked at this event in particular is that essentially every variety of unit was moved down a peg. Any normal unit was essentially moved from being governed by the rule of 3 to being effectively an epic hero. You can only have 1 of each of those data sheets in the army. Battle line units and dedicated transports that follow a rule of 6 instead get the rule of 3. So if you could previously be taken in up to 6 incarnations in your army, in this event only be taken in up to 3, any other unit in the game cannot be included alongside duplicates. You can only have 1 of each data sheet. That's important to keep in mind as we discuss the winning list from the event. Jeff Jew's Gladius Task Force Dark Angels. This army included Azrael, as well as a Justiciar, a Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, and Lionel Johnson. We had a single Assault Intercessor squad, a unit of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors for utility, a single Ballistus Dreadnought, a single unit of Deathwing Knights, one Gladiator Lancer, one unit of Infiltrators, one unit of Inner Circle Companions to hang out with our best friend Azrael, a Predator Destructor, a single Scout Squad, one Vindicator for some backline shooting, and one Callous Assassin as well. Space Marines having such a deep bench of units, I think, means that they can actually succeed in this format where some other factions might lose access to units that they need to take in duplicates in order to compete. Space Marines don't have that problem, however, and they're just going to be fine digging into their deep bench of almost identical unit varieties. It doesn't hurt that they also have a bunch of good epic heroes that you can't take in duplicates anyway, so being able to take things like Lionel Johnson and Azrael allows you to fill those spaces without really having to worry about the fact that you can't have multiple instances of a Space Marine captain or something. Now, we've discussed Chaos Knights and their dominance this week, but let's talk about their loyalist mirror, Imperial Knights, as we move over to New Zealand for the Lakes of Blood Rotorua. This event was a 22-player GT, being held, as I mentioned before, in New Zealand, and was taken down by Joshua McChelsea, rocking Imperial Knights. Joshua was taking a Cerastus Knight Lancer, a single Knight Crusader, as well as, interestingly, a Knight Warden, a dual-purpose Questora's chassis, rocking an Avenger Gatling Cannon alongside a Thunderstrike Gauntlet. Not really a datasheet that we see too often getting overshadowed by things like the Cerastus Knight Atropos. Also included were 3 Armigers, 2 Helverins, as well as a single Armiger Warglaive to benefit from bondsman abilities, as well as to add a little bit of high OC to the army. But not to be outdone, we also saw a pretty reasonable number of Imperial agents. The list included a Vordsman and an Arms unit to add another small light utility unit for relatively cheap, a Navigator in order to protect the army's backline, something that Knights do struggle with since it's very difficult for them to screen effectively with only 6 or 7 models in a typical Knight's army, unless you are focusing very heavily on Armigers, and even then, those Armigers need to be in the fight for most of the game and not sitting on your backline screening. The Voidsman and the Navigator certainly help with that, but last and certainly not least, we also had a Deathwatch kill team, a pretty cool inclusion who can not only bring another relatively high volume unit, although there are only 5 Deathwatch Marines in that unit, but they also can pack a little bit of a punch, rocking 2 Deathwatch Thunderhammers, an Infernus Heavy Bolter, and a pair of power weapons. This gives you another unit that you can use to hold down objectives in place of a more expensive Armiger, but can also skirmish with other lighter units. These guys will fight basically anyone's utility and probably beat them, being a more elite style of infantry. Now last, and I don't know, maybe least, it's up to you, we're going to move all the way over to Denmark and discuss the West Coast War Games GT. This was a 22-player GT, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, was one of the events that had multiple undefeated players at the end because we did see a natural draw occur in round 5. Death Guard and Tyranids both drew for the final placement, which is, first of all, absolutely wild. Now, we've talked about Death Guard already and their several event wins and undefeated results this week, but we haven't talked about Tyranids, which is what we're going to do now. Tim Verbeek went undefeated with a Tyranid Vanguard onslaught. This included 3 Broodlords, the Death Leaper, a Neuro Tyrant, a Winged Hive Tyrant, as well as 2 Winged Tyranid Primes. We had 3 units of 10 Genestealers to attach those Broodlords into, 3 Lictors to go hang out with the Death Leaper, I guess, and add a ridiculous amount of utility to the army, a single Neuro Lictor, as well as 2 units of Raveners to add some additional super fast infantry sweeping, as well as their ability to uppy downy and act as utility for the army, and 2 units of Tyranid melee bioweapon warriors to attach to those Winged Hive Tyrants, get the benefits of the Vanguard Onslaught, and have a faster moving model in the unit to allow them to make charges more easily. Now, I've made a video in the past about how ridiculously powerful the melee bioweapon warriors can be. They have been nerfed recently with a change to Vanguard Onslaught, meaning that it's more difficult to trigger battle shock checks from their surprise assault stratagem, meaning that it's tougher to get access to the Neurolictors +1 to wound. If you are able to get access to that though, these melee bioweapon warriors can kill like basically anything, they hit ridiculously hard once all their buffs are active. Styles of lists, we've seen styles of lists like these largely in team events, but the massive pressure created by Genestealers being followed up with all of the lone operatives like Lictors and the fast units like Raveners, and being finally anchored by both the Winged Hive Tyrant and the threat of the 2 melee bioweapon warrior units is incredibly powerful. This list can struggle or run into issues if it goes second or runs into particularly heavy screening, but if the stars align for it, it can absolutely lock the opponent out of having a capacity to score at all. Basically just locking their army in their deployment zone and sticking lone operatives on every objective. And clearly that worked out for Tim since he went undefeated. And with that is going to be all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one was your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, as well as 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this episode of the best armies in 40k. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.